coming today. I'm Anthony Pennings, a professor in the Department of Technology and Society here at SUNY Korea. And my presentation today, how IT, came to rule the world.
Would you maximize it? It's on the...
I will.
Oh, okay, I see.
Okay. I'm going to switch to my document,
Okay.
to my manuscript here at times. But actually, I'm going to start off. This is the book version of it, at least the sort of condensed version of it. But to kind of describe the framework which I'm using, I think the PowerPoint works better to start off with, and then I'll switch to the manuscript. The manuscript allows me to put more images and diagrams and things that I think would make the presentation a bit easier and interesting for you. But let me just go ahead and start with the sort of overall framework, and then now I can sort of switch. So, in terms of a framework, I use this techno-structuralist approach, and this term here, actually attributed to Marshall McLuhan, but there's really somebody else in this whole area called media ecology. But it's a paraphrasing of Winston Churchill's, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. I believe that's what it was. It was because the House of the major House of Representatives in London was destroyed during the war, and so they're making an argument for rebuilding as soon as possible.
Charlie Chaplin also said something that when I put my dress on, my costume on, it makes me to play the role.
Sorry, who said that?
Charlie Chaplin.
Charlie Chaplin, yes. Okay, good. So, but it refers in a sense to this reciprocal effects that I'm looking at between technology and power. So there's this relationship back and forth. So I'm going to be looking at information technology, IT, in the context of power, structures of power that have conceptualized, designed, funded, and utilized these technologies over time. Particularly I'm going to point out some powerful historical forces that have shaped and continue to shape information, communication, related technologies like social media. And overall, there's, I would say, 4 methodological concerns that I use to shape this analysis. Started this since my master's degree in the late 1980s, when I decided to look at the financial institutions, banks, things like that, and how they were really powerfully shaping the information technology and the networks that were associated with it. So again, it's institutions, it's institutional power. To some extent, there's a political economy involved. Also, the production of meaning. So, I mean, why is information technology important? And so, particularly my research on spreadsheet capitalism, very interested in analyzing spreadsheets as a type of technology of power that has been very influential in certainly this move to financial networks and the rise of financial technology, but also a number of changes in sort of institutions, the way corporations are run these days. And of course, there's always people involved, right? There's always agency involved. And so how they are empowered and what sort of environment we're creating in terms of a democratic environment is something that I'm concerned with as well. So 4 forces that shaped ICT. And I use this notion of regimes. So regimes are these historically unique configurations of commercial, military, scientific, political power that involve these market forces, political institutions, and the dynamics of human agency. Again, sort of energy and talented people involved, but as I mentioned before, it's a techno-structuralist approach, so the structures that are involved are very important. So these are the 4 different areas in which I divided up the book: containment capitalism, digital monetarism, global integration and e-commerce, and data-centric security and commerce. So it's kind of historical, containment capitalism, pretty much beginning at the end of World War II, containing both finance and communism. And that was a very powerful combination of forces that come out of the New Deal that really do shape for the next, well, certainly from the 40s, the National Security Act of 1947, which creates the CIA, the Bretton Woods environment, which sort of takes the New Deal and globalizes it, creates the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other institutions that really do shape, that contain the capital and the sort of the energies, primarily of the U.S., and shape them through the space race, through the development of a worldwide, the DEW line and the SAGE system, which is the network that is created in order to protect the U.S. from first Russian bombers and then any kind of nuclear attack through ICBMs. Digital monetarism, which really starts in the 1970s. And again, these are forces that shape information technology. So we have the, particularly after Nixon took us off the gold standard in the early 1970s, there was a lot of currency fluctuation. And so these technologies were basically created to create a worldwide system of electronic money flows. Global integration, as it starts in the later 1980s, goes into the 90s, and it really is, finally, the sort of network environment which we have today, which allows me to call my daughter and talk with her for on a video conference for hours without really having to pay anything. So I kind of explain that as well, because the development of the World Trade Organization and the framework which was developed out of that sort of really kills off the old telecommunications system, based on PTTs, the post-telephone and telegraph systems. And during the Clinton administration, e-commerce becomes a major focus. And of course, the World Wide Web is created during the 1990s as well. So that's the global integration and e-commerce. And then data security and commerce, that is a term I'm still working with, but that's in a sense more recent. So that is after the dot-com crash. After 9/11, the emergence of the search engines, the powerful search engines like Google, for example, the development of big data and the collection of data from advertising and now from all sorts of sources, right? So the smart city, Fitbits, all different sources of information being collected. And so it's a little bit more about regimes and these major forces, this electronic defense system, SAGE. semi-automatic ground environment, which was created in the 1950s, which really helps IBM transform from a calculating company to a computer company. AT&T gets into the digital communication business because, so what it is that the Defense Early Warning System, the connection and the collaboration with Canada really sets up this whole electronic environment to protect the US. I don't know really how successful it really was. Of course, luckily we weren't attacked, but from SAGE, the computer industry is really created.
SAGE stands for what?
Semi-automatic ground environment. And it's a collaboration between the MIT and IBM. Created these huge computers that brought in and analyzed the information from these radar stations that went all the way from Alaska to the tip of Long Island. And so a lot of technology was developed in order to do that. This was in the 1950s, some $60 billion, which was a lot of money at that time.
It is still.
That really creates the data communication industry, that creates the computer industry. And then, number two, an international regime of capital flows, digital money, and financial news. If we forget how, in a sense, isolated different countries were from each other before the 1970s. They had these telegraph systems that allowed for some currency transitions, but really after Nixon took us off the gold standard, there was a lot of currency fluctuation, and Reuters came in with their money monitor rates and created the first virtual network for buying and selling currencies. And some other systems were developed. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank, it used to be called funds transfer, now it's called funds telecommunications. That was the first packet switching environment. The first privatized packet switching environment. So, because we did have the internet, or it was called the ARPANET at the time, but the banking networks were the first to take the ARPANET packet switching technology and to start to develop these value-added networks for moving money around the world. And then, by the 90s, we start to see the cost of communication. Personal computers allow a lot of people access to that sort of technology. We see then e-commerce emerge, primarily through the World Wide Web. So, in other words, systems of computerization and telecommunications emerged first from military concerns and space development, from banking and business operations, from the promise of a new economy, of global e-commerce, entertainment, and social engagement, and now addresses the issue of alien intelligence. Some use alien intelligence. That's from James Martin, who is a very famous scholar of telecommunications. So he wrote literally 100 books on data processing and telecommunication. So he wrote this book, it was about 2001, called Alien Intelligence, and I just decided today to throw it in there.
So it doesn't mean the alien intelligence thermometer.
No, it doesn't mean alien intelligence. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, is it really referring to those?
Yeah, no, I'm just playing with the term here.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess I believe in aliens, but I haven't seen any. But I'm not referring to those sorts of aliens at this time.
Oh, you are not?
No, no.
You are an alien. You have an alien registration card.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. Yes,
You
right here.
한국에서 외국인,
Call the man in black.
외국인들이
Right. So, yeah, anyway, so AI, you know, instead of calling it artificial intelligence, calling it an alien intelligence. Because it really is it's a new system for humanity. I mean, humanity has never had this sort of technological environment before.
Great shows.
And so it really is sort of new. So I'm only calling it alien to give it that sort of sense of newness and strangeness that I think it deserves. I think we can't go into it without really kind of understanding that this is new, this is different, and we really need to know what's going on. So what does an AI do? So it produces, it collects and renders, it processes behavioral data, information on, you know, I mentioned Fitbits before, so now we're wearing Fitbits. So that information is collected on your heart rate, on your sleep cycles, things like that. And if we have time, we can get to it later. We're talking about how, yes, now part of like a Fitbit would be useful for helping you sleep better, determining when to go to sleep at night. It might be useful for helping you decide, maybe cut down on your cholesterol, things like that. So that sort of information is collected to help you, right? But now we're seeing environments where that information is also seeped off, something they used to call data exhaust, right? So the data could actually be collected by insurance companies and or your doctor, things like that. So it could be used for ultimately creating new pharmaceutical drugs and things like that. So that's the sort of monitoring. So we have behavioral data for monitoring, but also maybe modification of consumer and political sentiments. I've been writing about the Russian situation, not about the collusion, but how much were some of the Russians and related organizations involved in putting information into our social media in order to affect our behavior and our political sentiments, even if it's just to get us upset about things. Switch over to the manuscript. And these are all the ones the points that I pretty much covered. Well, I'm sorry, my screen looks a little bit bigger than yours. So I've given you kind of an overview, and so I kind of want to go back to each one and explain them in a little bit more detail. So, regime one, containing capitalism, in Bretton Woods. Now, Bretton Woods was the meeting of the Allies just before the end of World War II, and it was the attempt, pretty much knew that we were going to win the war by 44, and so the Bretton Woods system was created. So it was primarily to stabilize currencies. It followed the New Deal's currency. So the New Deal pretty much regulated gold and the price of gold at about $35 an ounce. And the Bretton Woods continued that $35 an ounce and set up relationships with different currencies around the world. For example, the yen was set at 360 yen to the dollar.
What did Eisenhower say?
Oh, sorry. yeah, this is famous. So in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. Potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So, the part of containment capitalism and as I mentioned before, was to contain communism, and we pretty much went into a permanent war economy at that time. I mentioned the National Security Act of 1947, which created the spy and intelligence operations, but of course we went into the Korean War after that, the Vietnam War, etc. But let me just give us the image of what?
Fort Knox.
Fort Knox. So Fort Knox was created by FDR because he was, gathering the country's gold, and didn't want it in New York because this was during the 30s, and they were worried about U-2 boats coming in from Germany and maybe taking over Manhattan and taking the gold from Manhattan, which they were doing throughout Europe. Going into Czechoslovakia, for example, and the first thing they do is go to the central bank and get the gold, because that was one of the things that they were really after.
Russia?
No, Germany.
Oh, yeah.
Germany. So, but I'm using it here as kind of a metaphor for the containment of finance. Because to really understand the 40s and 50s and 60s, you have to realize that the U.S. had created a system to high taxes, for example. Taxes, marginal rates in the 90s.
So what was Fort Knox created for? You said it
To
was.
store the gold.
Yeah, to store the gold.
Oh, I see, that's what it
Store
was.
the government's supply of gold.
Oh, I see.
And
okay.
FDR
Converted.
confiscated all citizens' gold.
Yeah, FDR, yes, as Mark said, confiscated the gold. Put it in Fort Knox, but the gold becomes, and the Fort Knox gold becomes the foundation for the Bretton Woods system, because it was a worldwide system that was based on this dollar-gold connection and other currencies like the Deutsche Mark, and the pound and the yen, all connected to the dollar at set rates. And the International Monetary Fund was developed in order to make sure to help countries maintain a stable currency and maintain that stable relationship between their currency and the other. So that was the whole sort of trade regime at the time. Right? But it was a system that allowed for the containment of finance, as I said, but that gets channeled into nation-building activities, and so particularly the space race. And the space race is particularly important for the development of information technologies, because it's really in the space race that the transistor is tamed. And when I say tamed, maybe that's not the best term, but the transistor, which was invented when, Jim?
1947.
Yeah, 1947, right? But was a very simple technology at first. It was melted literally into something called integrated circuits, and then ultimately by early 1970s, the microprocessors, where you have thousands and then hundreds of thousands, ultimately sort of millions of transistors on a little chip. That was created because of the space race and mutually assured destruction. mutually assured destruction that was the policy, right? That was, we had SAGE, we had this defense early warning system, but that was the system supposedly that kept us from all being nuked. But in order to have the guidance systems for the missiles, and ultimately for the Apollo program, they needed to miniaturize the transistors. And so that is where the transistor of 1947, which was an interesting technology but not overly useful, was honed into the type of microprocessors that allowed for the Altair to be created, which was the little computer that got Bill Gates involved with computers. Well, actually, not with computers, but with microcomputers or personal computers. That was during the early 1970s. And really made computers a commercially viable system. We'll see how the IMF, GATT, and World Bank later emerge as important institutions that help transition telecommunication from national systems, so now I went to New Zealand. New Zealand was a very interesting example. The telecommunication system was run by the postal system. And the telecommunication system at first was just a kind of a branch of that. Ultimately that separated, became New Zealand Telecom. But we'll see how ultimately the emergence of the worldwide debt crisis that emerged in the 1970s was the major sort of stimulus which broke up the telecommunication system and allowed for the internet to be sort of inserted into the old telephone systems. So let me move it. So 1950s, we had the atomic and hydrogen bombs, and that set off the Cold War, the space race, including mutually assured destruction, and the race to the moon. Is this big enough? Do you want a little bit bigger?
We can,
That's good.
Anthony, but your argument that the space race and the military influenced the initial development of the transistor, have you looked at what was going on at Bell Labs and who funded Shockley?
Yes,
His,
yes. So it was
because it's really highly interesting to me that the transistor was invented at Bell Labs, and then a few months later, Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of communication and information theory was born, also at Bell Labs. So what kind of research do you do to document that this is really driven by military and space race versus let's improve our telephone networks? That certainly must have been part of it to improve the
Yes,
telephone
well,
network.
you're absolutely right. Bell Labs created the transistor, but why did AT&T become a major computer power? It was because the Justice Department said no. The Justice Department said, Ma Bell, AT&T, you are a monopoly. You cannot go into the computer business. And so what happened is that AT&T licensed that technology. It licensed technology to some Japanese companies and some American companies like Texas Instruments, TI. And so it was absolutely an important event, but quite crucial in that AT&T did not monopolize that technology. Who knows what would have happened if...
Was there politics or there was a plan to get it away from AT&T?
Yeah, both, right. So there was AT&T was monopoly, and I'm trying to remember, because I did write half a chapter on this issue.
It's into the early 80s. When was the monopoly broken up? I don't remember. Do you recall?
1982 to 1984.
Okay.
AT&T was broken, but we're talking about the early 50s. But yes, the AT&T was not allowed to go to the computer business. AT&T was not allowed really to utilize the transistor technology. So they licensed it out, and that allowed other companies like IBM to utilize that technology. Well, thanks, Jim. Sputnik. Remember Sputnik? Sputnik, a little satellite.
59? What was the year? 59?
56,
56.
57. So that was a major thorn in the U.S. society. There was a lot of concern about the U.S. getting ahead in space technology. And so what did the U.S. do? Well, it created ARPA. That was one of the major things it did. And we know that ARPA ultimately invented the internet. And so, and has developed driverless vehicles and things like that. So Sputnik was a very important stimulus for the U.S.
There's a DARPA also too.
Yeah, it's more commonly referred to, I think, as DARPA.
Yeah, that came later.
It's under the Department of Defense.
Right.
Started as ARPA.
It started as
Oh,
ARPA,
sorry,
but now
and
it's
then
DARPA.
later came DARPA.
Yeah, there were some complications during the 70s, had something to do with the Vietnam War, and it went back and forth, DARPA, ARPA, for a while. Ultimately, yes, it stayed as DARPA. And DARPA contracted with BBN, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which was a Boston company. They're the ones that developed the ARPANET. They also, one of my professors at the University of Hawaii created the Aloha system, which is the foundation for Ethernet and all wireless technologies. That was using some of the early packet switch, but using radios in order to, well, connect different islands in an experiment in this wireless packet broadcast system. And they got a lot of money from the Navy to do that, because the Navy was very interested in data broadcasts over large areas of water. And then, of course, using all the Nazi V2 technology in order to start the space race. Top secret spy system, the Corona system, and the keyhole system. Are you familiar with keyhole? Satellite systems, early spy systems. Do you know who owns keyhole system now? You might have even used them recently. They're owned by Google. So Google bought up all the keyhole satellites and using it for Google Maps.
Yeah, it's right there, the answer.
They're so good. And in doing the spy satellites, it opened the skies for all satellites, because Eisenhower had proposed this. That was kind of a big issue at the time, open skies plan. So, who owns the air rights above your state, above your country, right? And so it's pretty much been decided that nobody in particular owns it at that level. And that was an important sort of international policy that was set with the spy satellites. Now, we use a lot of satellites for data communications and for telephone systems. And we can thank the author Arthur C. Clarke for his vision, which really conceptualized the notion of putting satellites, or what he called rocket stations, into what we now call geosynchronous orbit. So it is an orbit where a satellite will remain, as the Earth turns, it'll remain above a particular location. So if you have these huge Earth stations, you don't have to try to follow try to follow the satellite. But you notice it's around the equator, and Earth stations are primarily focused south, here in the north here, below the equator. And so, based on Newton's law, that, it said if you have a cannon high enough and you shoot a cannonball, it's just going to go, and gravity's going to take it, and gravity is going to propel it, well, pull it in as the force of the kind of explosion keeps the cannonball going. But that's basically the idea of satellites. And so this is now called the Clark Belt, and this is where we have lots of
No parking spaces left.
There's basically no, yeah, there's a lot.
All the parking slots.
There was a lot of competition over like the US and Europe, but now the technology.
Anthony, I'm gonna have to leave soon, but I'd just like to comment, the overall arching effect of this is linked to what they call the RMA, which is the Revolution of Military Affairs, which started back in the early 70s and reached its fruition up until the defeat of the Soviet Empire. Thirdly, the RMA initiative in stimulating these kinds of technological platforms to be put into the concentration of defense was clearly seen during the QDRs. The QDRs from 1974 all the way up to 1989 had tremendous amounts of budget allocated to what they call the Quadrennial Defense Review, which they used in ammunition to keep those technology companies down. And, so that is sort of one of the overarching things on this. Yeah. So I'm gonna have to go.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Period of time. So satellites. Now satellites, we still use them, and now we have other orbits that we use, low Earth orbits with high arches that allow satellites to come in really close for spying purposes and then go back out, come back in. And we've got medium Earth satellites that we use, like for the GPS system, the global positioning system, that, because there's like 27 satellites, they can move around, and you have your device and it triangulates or quadrangulates from several different satellites, but there's a lot of stuff in space. As Jim mentioned, there's not a lot of parking spaces left.
And that's a pollution, some old satellites.
Yeah, garbage, how to clean up the space garbage is becoming more and more of a.
That is a big issue. So as I mentioned before, the nuclear arms race contributed substantially to the development of transistors and microprocessing devices. Now, the bureaucracies of the Great Society were also pretty important. We had, the Social Security Act, of course, was really important for IBM. That was back in the 30s. That was part of the New Deal. But Ross Perot's Electronic Data Systems, which was ultimately bought by General Motors, because he made his money from Medicaid, Medicare contracts. And then, of course, Xerox. Xerox really became very rich during the 1970s, and they created PARC, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And PARC hired this guy, Robert Taylor, who was from ARPA, and funded all these computer science departments. And so he funded all these computer science departments around the US. And so he knew like the brightest minds in computer science all around the US. So he brought them to Xerox PARC. And PARC created the Alto system, Aloha Alto system, because it had the Ethernet system in, but this of course shows the mouse, so they invented the mouse. And it's too bad we don't have the screen here, but the drop-down menus, and the whole graphical user interface. Xerox allowed Apple and Steve Jobs to come in and really get the technology in exchange for being able to buy a lot of Apple stock early on. And so that's how this technology goes from Xerox to the Lisa and the Macintosh, and then ultimately to all the IBM compatible Windows systems. But Xerox was very important for that whole transition. So here we come back to the ARPANET, basically the first data packet switching network was created in 1969. And the ARPANET took off was primarily in California, and then ultimately sort of expanded around the US. And the TCP protocols, transmission control protocols, there was a lot of debate about what were going to be the emerging protocols. At the time in the 1970s, the ITU was not really that interested, because they primarily worked for the telephone companies, and the telephone companies wanted something that they could have more control over. Ultimately, a packet switching system with the protocols X.25 and X.75 for transmission between computers, and the X.75 was a gateway protocol that allowed for different networks to be combined. But they took the lead in that. The military really sort of kept the TCP alive until the National Science Foundation decided to go with it. But there was interest in packet switching technology. I mentioned SWIFT, and some of the other banking networks were interested in it and used the technology, and invented it. Robert Kahn here, Bob Kahn, sort of conceptualized it with his work on survivable communications in the 1960s. That was the notion that, well, if you have a network and one part of the network, say you have like the US system, you have data connections between, say, Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. Well, you might have something to go to Chicago and on to D.C., but if Chicago is nuked, God forbid, well, what would be the system that would say, okay, well, I can't use Chicago, so I'll reroute to another way. So the routing technology sort of comes from this notion of survivable communication in the 1960s.
And also, I think irrigation and watering systems.
Oh yeah, influence it now, that's interesting. Yeah.
If the water pipe breaks at one point, how?
Right, right. Well,
So
that
that's
makes sense.
Ben Bernanke, isn't that? The person?
Ben Bernanke? No, it
No,
looks
it's
like
Bill
Ben Bernanke.
Clinton. Surf.
That's Vin Cerf.
Vincent Cerf,
Yeah,
and
this
then
is
in the
Bob
middle,
Kahn.
Bob Kahn,
Oh, okay.
and then Bill
And Bill
Clinton.
Clinton.
Yeah.
Surf, who did he
Yeah.
work for? Do you remember? He's Science Foundation?
He was,
Or he's ARPA?
He worked for ARPA, he was a graduate student, but he did a lot of his work at Stanford.
Okay.
And ultimately he went on to work for MC SDI, and now Google.
That's interesting, I didn't know he came out of the Stanford, Silicon Valley zone.
The International Telecommunication Union does start to get involved, and but there's kind of tension. But really, this guy Major Honey, when he orders the ARPANET to go to TCP/IP in January of 1983, I think that was really when TCP was.
Why did they give the order then? What's happening that's leading to that? Is it just the larger network required IP addressing now?
The network
or-
is growing, and what I was mentioning about survivable community, they just saw the value in it, and they did not have the same concerns as the telecommunication companies.
Sorry for interrupting, but it's interesting to me, I never thought about this, but it's TCP first, but then IP is added much later. We kind of think that a network is made of its particular nodes with names, but you're suggesting that the TCP the naming was not really required, because why? Because it was such a low number of stations when the ARPANET began? Or why did they add IP addressing to that and not at the very beginning?
Well, I think, the whole internet was evolving, and TCP, as you pointed out, came before IP, but you have to look at the OSI model and the layered models that are widely accepted now by engineers and people who work on standards. These address, the IP part addresses different layers of the.
Okay.
Yeah,
I see.
so
Yeah.
TCP basically takes things from your application and turns it into packets, and IP is the technology that allows the packets to go over.
Do you want some water?
It's a very moving story.
The point is sort of touching. Star Wars was actually important. So the SDI or Star Wars actually put a lot of money into the development of. Now, ultimately, the National Science Foundation, the National Science Foundation met. Now, Star Wars was a system to develop this space-based defense system. And it was decided that they needed a lot of artificial intelligence, they were calling it at the time. And so a lot of money went into the National Science Foundation to connect supercomputers around the US. And in doing that, the backbone technologies were developed. Because the initial backbone technology was 56K. But it continued to go. So SDI was pretty important. There's a lot of money that went into it. Also, something that was important was Japan was starting to get into artificial intelligence as well, and that got a lot of people in Congress concerned. And it was one of the reasons that Al Gore got involved. Al Gore and the Atari Democrats, as they were called at the time, got involved with technology, with communication technology, data technology, and instructed the National Science Foundation to continue to fund these developments. And Gore produced the Supercomputer Network Act of 1986. Remember, there's a whole issue, did Gore invent the internet? And of course, he never said he did, but the evidence is there that he did a lot to create this transition.
He also gave a speech that's very interesting at the Information Superhighway Summit in Los Angeles, talking to a bunch of information-related policy people from industry about the Clinton's administration's initiative for digital technologies. There's actually video available of that plus the full transcript. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah, I continue to talk about Gore and his impact, but, so we have TCP/IP protocols that are taken up by the military, and the ARPANET is growing, and the NSF net is growing. And then there's these people at Stanford University who create Cisco, basically, because they see that it's important to be able to route data communication, primarily on campus. That was their initial concern. They both worked on campus. But they obtained access to this guy, Billy Yeager. He worked for the medical school for a multi-protocol blue box router in 1985. So this is the foundational technology for Cisco's success. And of course, they are a major player in the whole development of the internet. So they provide.
Well, just, you know, an interesting point, Cisco has been a major player, but Huawei now and other Chinese manufacturers, if you look at data on exports of telecommunications products, including routers and all the components, all the systems that nuts and bolts make up the internet, China is way out in front of the second, third, fourth countries. In the last 10 years, it has emerged to the point where it's more than just worry about Huawei. It's a question of, you know, Cisco is becoming a relatively smaller player.
Yes.
But that's another.
Yeah, they don't have all the radio technology and stuff that Huawei does. So Cisco, and this was their AGS router, which made them so much money, got them started. So this is the technology that starts to route TCP IP information.
The thing about all these routers, I mean, they're in a little metal case with a rack. They're all similar. You know, whether you're looking at a 5G mobile device or this router or that router, but it's the software that really makes it home.
So going back a little bit, 71, Nixon takes this off the gold standard, and there's a lot of currency fluctuations. And so Reuters, as I mentioned, they had gotten involved with technology, something called Stock Master, which gave quotes about stock prices, but didn't really take off. It wasn't until, and even the Reuters, let me just go to their technology here. This is the Reuters money monitor rates. This is the technology that really takes off. Primarily, there was some fluctuation. Reuters was struggling a little bit, but then the oil embargo and
What year was that?
Okay, so this is 73, 77. Yeah, 1973 really took off because that was the Arab-Israeli war when things really took off.
So 7 years before.
67 was one of them.
Yes, right, yes. So there was tension there, but they didn't have the technology at that time. So, but that was the beginning of the oil crisis. So the oil crisis were really important. So the
And soon show up here on Fed.
the money monitor rates. So basically, this was a system that they sold to banks throughout the world, and banks would both pay to, they would subscribe to get the information, but they would also pay to put their own currency prices onto it.
Who did they pay?
Reuters.
The Reuters made
Yes,
this.
it's a Reuters. This is
I think
Reuters.
7 years later, we're still seeing, when the IBM PC came out, still seeing the green phosphorus screen and
Right.
basic keyboard layout, so, yeah.
So this was a really fundamental technology in this whole area that I call digital monetarism. So there's all this fluctuation going on, and there's the development of the euro dollar. So basically, these new telecommunication systems allowed for euro dollars to be held outside of the U.S. And one of the things that was happening was, we started to send a lot of cash to the OPEC countries, right? Just because the prices of oil went up, and some huge surpluses of money were created. And what were these countries going to do? They didn't really have a developed banking system. So they put that money, they gave it to the banks, the international banks, and the banks said, what are we going to do with this? So they started going around the world, going to Indonesia, to Brazil, giving money for development projects. Korea actually got a lot of money at that time. They used it pretty successfully, but a lot of countries, like Poland, the USSR, New Zealand had trouble, went into debt. So by the early 1980s, there was the third world debt crisis. So what does this have to do with telecommunications or IT? Well, that becomes the window. That becomes the system. Because these countries are so in debt, New Zealand, where I went, they sold their telecommunications system to New York baby bells, to U.S. baby bells, including the New York system. Of course, it's now Verizon, whatever. But countries started to sell assets. And in order to do that, telecommunications systems were developed. Now, to lend out the money, banks would kind of join together in this process they call syndicated loan lending. So banks would get together in order to lend Brazil, say, $50 million or something like that. And they would use telecommunication systems because the system got so, in a sense, automated, right, with first word processors and stuff like that, that there was a lot of pressure to be able to move data quickly. But ultimately then, these countries get into a lot of debt, and when Reagan comes in, he gets the IMF involved, and the IMF says, okay, you guys are heavily in debt. You're not going to get any more money unless you go through structural adjustment. You're not going to get more money unless you really change your whole system. You got to open up your country to capital moving in and out, to news moving in and out, and you have to start buying international telecommunication equipment. So that is the sort of lever which opens up the world for ultimately the internet that we have now. It's the debt crisis that really does that. I gotta move sort of quicker here. I mentioned SWIFT before. So anyway, the basic point here is that because of the oil crisis and these huge flows of money around the world, that was a major stimulus for the development of a lot of information technology and for the breaking apart and ultimately the privatization of initially government-owned telecommunication systems, opening them up to international capital.
It's also, right after the gold windows closed, it's fluctuating, but within a year or so, that's the U.S. deal with Saudi Arabia, then the #1 oil exporter, to peg U.S. dollars to Saudi Arabia's export. So nobody could buy the #1 oil exporter's oil unless they traded dollars dollars to Saudi Arabia. So that propped up US currency, stabilized that. It's sort of a pseudo Bretton Woods, but not based on gold, but based on oil. But of course, oil coming from multiple places at the same time. But it's that kind of system that's still sort of in place and connected to a lot of US wars in the past 20 years whenever a country tries to go off the US petrodollar and take a petro-euro, for instance, or try something else, that innately destroys that US financialization around oil as well as control. It lowers the price of the dollar. So it's I'm saying, I agree with what you're saying, but the flip side is it's not just the military driving the finance, but the idea that to keep the finance up, you invade a country to keep the US dollar higher. I mean, it's flips, it's both directions of causality, I think.
Yes.
I think not only, I think they said any international money exchange has to go by dollar.
Yeah, in Saudi Arabia.
Not
For
only
oil.
petrol, I mean, not only for oil, but any kind of,
Was it? Okay. Yes.
any thing international kind of money exchange should be.
Yeah, don't quote me. I think that's 1973 when the petro-dollar was sort of structured.
Remember, so we're moving into a different regime here. So there's a different logic working, right? So yes, I mean, you still have the military, right? You still have sort of government contracts that's shaping a lot of the technology. But you have, and that's why I mentioned Nixon taking us off the gold standard. That really is a turning point for the development, the commercialization, if you will, of information technology. And then these other implications like the movement of money around the world and the debt crisis, and then how the debt crisis then is used in order to break apart national systems. Walter Wriston wrote a book, he was a famous banker, called The Twilight of Sovereignty in 1992, kind of outlining this. Now I mentioned spreadsheets before, and that is another thing that's kind of occurring here. So there were microcomputers in the 1970s, but you have an Apple II, VisiCalc here, the VisiCalc technology, and then really the IBM PC and the Lotus 1-2-3 spreadsheet, which is the sort of killer app of the 80s, right? And is involved in a lot of new financial dealings, partially in terms of the being used in order to evaluate. So part of my argument is that the whole privatization process is made possible because of spreadsheet technologies that allow for the accounting, the valuation, the itemization of all the resources by these PTTs, by these telecommunication companies. So just imagine, so you have a government-owned telecommunication system. Well, they're not really keeping track of all the poles and how much is the copper wire worth and things like that. It's not until you have the 1980s and this move towards financialization. And I argue that the spreadsheet was really important in this, in valuing these companies and moving them into government-owned enterprises, and then ultimately being listed on stock exchanges and becoming privatized. So there is there are technologies and accounting logics that are used ultimately by the investment banks that really made a lot of money in this whole process of privatizing telecommunication systems. But the spreadsheet becomes really important in a lot of different ways for a lot of different organizations, and becomes really important. It's considered the early on the killer app. So why do people want PCs? Well, one of the reasons was because the VisiCalc and Lotus 1-2-3 applications were so attractive. And of course, we had word processors, but you weren't really connected to the internet at that time. Maybe I
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
Not until the web came along.
Right.
pre-web, before the web, I was on the internet in the eighties, so, but it was organized along those CRT screens. 2600 baud modems to the telephone
Yeah, I
lines.
mean, it was very limited,
Mhm.
yeah. I think the web, the invention of the World Wide Web is what really made it take off.
It removed the programming necessities to
Yeah.
manipulate the exchange of information, so layman people could do it, basically. After that, wasn't just a programming culture of nerdy men in their basements, exchanging software and knowledge.
There's a whole lot of things that happen when Reagan comes in, and he has his ally Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher really, with the privatization of British Telecom, was really the first to initiate these wide-scale privatization issues. But there's a whole lot of deregulation of banking and relaxing antitrust and tax cuts, securitization of student debt, for example, and other financial institutions. That would rear its ugly head in the 2007, 2008, when we had the securitization of all these mortgages, and that collapsed. But that starts with securitization of student debt. Removing caps on interest rates, so you have these credit cards at 20% interest and things like that. Increasing U.S. debt to feed the bond industry and provide additional hedges for financial risk-taking. Yes, so the reason we have government debt is because we want to feed the financial system, and we want to provide at least a hedge, a way of reducing risk for those. So selling off government agencies and assets, strengthening the dollar.
Is this your global international e-commerce period, or?
This is still monetarism,
Okay.
digital monetarism. But pressuring countries around the world to enhance the flow of U.S. produced news, so really removing itself from UNESCO and other those concerns at the time that the news wires at the time held a lot of power. And it's in general just allowing money to flow around the world. And these are all quite important for information technology. Different things like cash management, account systems, things like that start to emerge.
And that's your idea that the national containment, as you said, that word is ending.
Ending,
Of
yes.
setting the jurisdictions of all the finance away from national governments towards just individual companies themselves. Like you said, removing the credit card limitation. It's a good example of,
Right,
if the market bore 22% interest, that's what unfortunately it became, for credit cards.
Yeah, so Reagan and Thatcher, they wanted to crush the New Deal and the whole system of containment. Not containing
Communism, just the finance.
but containing finance, yes. And maybe it was time for that. So Sun Microsystem workstations become popular for rocket scientists, quants on Wall Street. Financial engineering emerges.
That's nostalgic.
Credit card authorization system. We moved from this to the Visa authorization system based on tandem computers. Tandem was a big computer company.
I'd totally forgotten about that. Remember you had to run your card across a mimeograph machine to get
It was only a couple of years later that Easy Check
Really?
was introduced here in Korea, because the networks were really up to speed here, and a friend of mine who taught at Kodae, his friend was the founder of that company. You can still see these Easy Check machines in restaurants, places that you go.
And my daughter, a couple of years ago, I made her pose for a Bloomberg box. So the Bloomberg box emerges, and whereas Reuters was kind of a global communication system, the Bloomberg box really provided the analytics. And that was really important for the growth of national debt and allowed people to understand what's happening with the bond markets, which become so important. Yeah, so what do we want to actually do here?
It's up to you, I'm sorry for interrupting. I
Right,
just
yeah,
wanted
so-
to make
so-
a note of time that
Right.
it's 20 minutes till the end of the session.
Right. But feel free to ask questions
Okay.
as we go along. So Bloomberg Box, a very important technology. And makes Bloomberg a millionaire, right? Because it costs a lot to subscribe to these systems. We were at a trade show, so I got my daughter to pose there for a moment. But you know, the financial industry pushes hard to privatize telecommunication systems around the world. Because
So that capital and news, if you had to answer the question of which flow is more important, capital or news, what would your answer be?
News was already very international.
yeah, but not so much. And we had the AP wires and
Reuters from the 70s to 80s. That's telegraph networks. And the major telegraph junctions in Europe or the United States became the major news capitals.
Yeah, but that was, I mean, that happened decades
Oh, yeah.
before the, what really changed things is the impact of digitization. You know, a little bit more generally than Anthony is presenting here, you had with the putting digital switches into phone networks, then brought about the internet, the World Wide Web. And so that created all kinds of changes in storage of digital information, transmission of digital information, and computing to manipulate. It had three major sort of functions that, and Hilbert at USC has done a lot of work on quantifying this. You might be interested.
I was just
Looking at-
doing the mobile class yesterday, and in my head is the three terms of Castell's network society. I think what Jim was saying with digitization, it does make those three things easier. More flexible, more survivable, and more,
And it wipes out national borders because
Yeah.
the digital packets fly around, they don't respect national borders.
yeah, if you're sending a disk, magnetic disk with information, that's easier to control than it is the data coming through the.
Well, in fact, the very design of the internet, I was looking at a video on this by a professor from somewhere, but, you know, it's an end-to-end system. And at the transport layer, the only concern of the engineers who designed the internet is that the packet get from where it originates to where it's supposed to go. But there's no concern with what's in the packet or, you know, any of this. It's just a reliable, yeah.
I kind of mentioned this before, the lever for dismantling the telecommunication monopolies, breaking down the barriers to international communications, really was found in the global debt crisis. That is the lever that sort of prized open the international system. Doesn't make it cheap yet. That occurs later with the global information infrastructure. So we go to regime 3. So you know, I give Clinton and Gore some credit. This is the famous quote from Gore. During my service in the U.S. Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet.
Straight out of Genesis, right?
There was a lot of emphasis on the economy because you know, when Clinton took over, there was a huge recession at the time. Bush 1 had a lot of success with the first Middle East war, driving the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but it wasn't enough to get him reelected. But there was a new optimism that kind of emerged with the first Gulf War. Remember, we watched
Well,
we watched these these guided missiles, right, with the cameras on, these smart bombs hitting their targets, and of course, the whole thing, the whole runaround Saddam Hussein's troops was because we had access to GPS technology for the first time. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, and that leads into enthusiasm for the internet. We also had the fall of the Berlin Wall, '89, the fall of communism. So there's a whole sort of pan-capitalist condition, free flows of information and money.
Then why, I mean, we can talk about it later, but continue, I'll hold my question.
No, go ahead.
I would just, well, you call the first regime kind of containment capitalism, containment communism, but you're just mentioning now we're in regime 3, but you still say the containment of capitalism doesn't end until 1989. I like the regime ideas, but sort of like overlapping regimes or, you know, this tendril of containment communism, you're saying continues until 89?
No.
Okay. So they're not,
Well,
so they're
yeah,
not trying to
yeah,
contain
yeah,
communism
right.
at all until,
No,
they
no,
are.
right, absolutely, yeah. So
Yeah.
it does continue. So yeah, I mentioned earlier, I tried to nuance that there is some overlap between the different regimes. Certainly, you know, one thing Reagan does is he comes in and puts a lot of money into the military, right? From Star Wars to all different Navy ships and things like that.
And that's the restructuration, debt crisis, pro-US, you know, structural readjustment through mostly IMF held stock by the United States. So the United States sort of drives these international institutions of lending. It's not really international. It's kind of like whoever has a stock in these world banks and IMF kind of drive of those international institutions. And a lot of the pressure was from the United States to not simply loan out anymore, but use it as sort of US foreign policy as well.
So, yeah, so some of the early killer apps, email, FTP, Gopher. Remember on the internet? I was
Gopher,
back then. The privatization of the National Security, the National Science Foundation Network in 1992. Congressman Rich Busher works with President Bush. Bush privatizes the internet, allows the NSF backbone to allow commercial service. And then Clinton and Gore come in and Clinton asks Gore to really take on science and technology.
So in the early 80s, it was CERF that convinced the government to make it the internet backbone public, but it wasn't until Bush 1992 you're saying it's privatized. Is that?
Yeah,
I'm just spreading the context that
that
it got bigger and public universities were allowed to connect to it outside of military structure, and then it was privatized in 1992, as you said.
There were contracts with IBM, MCI, in order to provide certain parts of the internet, the National Science Foundation. So you can say that's kind of a privatization, but to allow any sort of commercial traffic going through the internet, that was something that was not allowed because the National Security Act of 1950 said no commercial activities could be.
Okay, I misspoke when I said privatization. I meant commercialization.
One thing I see, you were saying that deficit, but I think what killed Bush was country at this time needed somebody who's very intellectual. At some time needed somebody, and when you're talking, very interesting because it seems why how these presidents are being elected, not other issues, but really Bush family went into this kind of ushered the internet. I remember I was at the Stanford conference and one of my colleagues said, now, you know, I've got a job at UNICEF and my job is to have this internet to create funding and so on and so forth. Like Obama is just creating new kind of war, like ISIS war, Bush type of war. It's very interesting your talk.
Thank you. I know I'm covering a lot of material.
I suggest, what's the fourth, just at least mention the fourth section.
Yeah, I'm going to go into that in a little bit. So, junk bonds, there was, the notion of the information superhighway emerges. So is it going to be the internet? Is it going to be telecommunication systems using ADSL? Is it going to be maybe even satellites? But cable also was kind of emerging. There was the AT&T TCI merger about that time. So the information superhighway and mobile was interested, but it was the development of junk bonds that really helped a lot of companies like MCI, TCI, Turner Broadcasting, right, CNN,
But-
Call Cellular.
That's a really interesting point. At what point do leaders in academia, government, industry start to talk about information superhighway? Or, you know, what pops to my mind is digital convergence. That goes back at least to Ithiel Poole at MIT in his book, Technologies of Freedom in 1983, I believe it was published.
83.
He's now referred to as the prophet of convergence, but clearly a few people could see how this was going to develop. I think Dr. Oh Myung, our founder, is one of those visionaries here in Korea, because the ability to sort of just imagine and visualize what might happen, you know, some decades hence is really cyberspace, another new term.
Yeah, that was
That
kind of
was-
an emergent term at the time. It sort of lubricated the discussions about we were talking about the internet, information superhighway. There was a number of these terms that were kind of emerging. Cyberspace was kind of one of the sexier ones. The internet hadn't really taken
It's
off.
interesting that CERN is very nuclear kind of organization on high super collider, but it is
So you probably know kind of the early internet, the hypertext transfer protocols, HTML, things like that. But this is kind of a point I want to make sure that I get across. How is it that the system really opened up? And so if we go back to Gore talking at the ITU, the development of global information infrastructure, and how they pushed that first, okay, at the ITU, but then going to the GATT, Uruguay round, and really pushing for the establishment of the World Trade Organization. And then two major things that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, did. They had two very early meetings. One was in Singapore that liberalized IT tariffs. So that was in '96, and the big player was Cisco, and this really opened up and reduced tariffs all around the world, so that PCs and router equipment and all that sort of stuff could be sold.
Anthony?
Yeah.
1994 was also the date of the Superhighway Summit at University of California, UCLA, where Gore spoke, and that video that I mentioned is available.
Is that the one with Lily Tomlin?
Yeah, Louis Tomlin comes in, Gore is
Famous
cracking
contest,
jokes
yeah.
because he was such a stiff speaker, but the reason that is important to me is because Gore was talking about it. Here in Korea, they actually started building. So Korea in the early stages of building out these, broadband really, cable broadband and so forth, that preceded the US and European countries, so.
The second World Trade Organization meeting was in Geneva, and that was the basic agreement on telecommunication services, and that just opened up, and we had privatization before that, but that just really opened up all sorts of telecommunication services. So, the GII plan, really pushed liberalization, competition, foreign investment, and the rest of the world went along with it. Interconnection guarantees, I don't know, an FCC type of regulator. But that really opened it up for Cisco and these other.
I can't resist
Sure.
raising an issue here. So your argument is that industry, and especially the financial industry, and had a very key role in the evolution of information, and Walter Wriston and all of that. My sort of comeback to that, having lived here from 1996 on, continuously, is why then did the industry fail to build the information superhighways in the US? Korea has actually built them, and in fact, right now, if you look at the news, it's all about 5G, and all three of the mobile service providers have tested their 5G. Samsung is coming out with a S10 5G compatible phone. So de facto, Korea will be the first country in the world to introduce 5G service. Regardless of what Verizon may say, they may have it here and there, but it's very spotty.
iPhone also says something.
The
iPhone has
iPhone.
I mean,
That's
who is producing iPhone? Is it Apple?
Apple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the iPhone will have a compatible device. But to really offer the service requires both infrastructure build out and part of that infrastructure is putting phones devices that are compatible with 5G in the hands of a large number of consumers. So Korea's out in the lead right now, worldwide, when it comes to 5G.
And it's coming out in a few months, or it's out now?
Yeah, within the next couple of months. The S10, I mean, they're already selling the 5G compatible phone, so.
Now, the last regime is something that I'm working on. It's something that actually had stopped my research because I really hadn't sort of conceptualized what was going on. So the early sort of net-centric development of the internet, I kind of understood global e-commerce, things like that. But now with security technologies, both in terms of the national security system, like DARPA's total information awareness, which kind of faded, but moving, sorry, I talk about.
Anthony, thank you for an
Sure.
excellent presentation. Sorry, I have to run.
No problem. We're finishing up here in 2.5 minutes, but
Well, I suggest, if people need to leave, but I will sit and listen to them. If you'd like to have feedback, please talk what you think is necessary.
Okay.
I will at least stay here. And this is also Entrepreneurship Day, which is a holiday, so there's may be less pressing schedules for others. But I will, be officially done, people can leave, but I encourage you to stay, and I will stay in here. if you'd like that. Yeah, okay.
good, okay. So, have you guys, a couple more minutes? Feel free to.
Yeah, a few
leave,
minutes.
right, yeah.
Okay.
So, so this becomes the sort of modern, Google. So I mentioned a little bit about the Patriot Act and 9/11, kind of at the level of national security, homeland security, things like that. But now I'm particularly interested in search technology and the development of data science technology. I'm taught in the winter, and now I'm teaching a course in data science management.
It has moved very, very,
It
a
is.
few years ago I was at Harvard and I took a course and it's really not,
It's moved
because
quite.
it comes into the meters and seconds and millimeters.
It's moved quite sort of substantially. But Google is really considered the foundational technology. Remember, they developed Backrub and another system. This is back in the 1990s. I call it the move from surfing to searching the internet, right? Before search engines, we surfed the internet. You type in something and follow the links and all. But the search engines came and said, well, we get you right to where you want to go, right?
Where they want you to go.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
That's the
That
power of
comes later.
the
That
big
comes
data
later.
and algorithmic.
But Backrub, which becomes PageRank, it really established Google as the technical leader in the late 1990s, but they didn't really have a revenue system. It wasn't until the Yellow Pages, or actually there was another
It
company.
doesn't exist anymore.
Yes, right, because of Google, right? This company called Idea Lab Bill Gross, they really came up with the idea. The Yellow Pages was a system that was used, and you'd look up for, if you needed landscaping, for example, you would go and look up landscaping.
I still do it. But
Right.
Only in your particular zone.
anymore.
Yeah.
So the idea is, instead of going to the Yellow Pages, you go on your computer and you type in landscaping, and the Google background PageRank system gets you supposedly the best landscapers, right, for your particular area. So,
You don't know if it's the best or not, but.
right. But that becomes a system that Google then is able to monetize, because they're able to auction off those words. So, you're able to, if you want to.
If you want higher rank, you buy a bigger ad.
Right, so,
Basically.
yeah, so you pay more, right, and you pay per click. So, if people don't click on it, then you don't have to pay, and so you feel a little bit better about it, and, yeah, it may not be,
That's very smart,
yeah.
because you don't pay just and nobody clicks.
So, this is the system that really transforms the whole internet, moving from surf to search, but it's that idea. And they actually, they negotiated with this company called, Bill Gross had this website called Overturn. And ultimately, Google went on to form their own called AdWords. But there was some legal concerns by Gross, but they paid him off handsomely. He's very happy about the whole thing. So AdWords, Google AdWords becomes the system that's really is the mint. You know what I mean? It prints money for Google, right? How much are they making now? $90 billion a year.
Yes, so it's 1,700 or something.
I think from the mobile class, Google is over 63 or 4% of all of online ad revenue in the United States.
And around the world probably, isn't it?
I don't have statistics, but it's just basically a new digital monopoly. It's one big Yellow Pages, instead of many different telecommunications versions for different locations.
Okay, thank you. It was wonderful talk, and I
Yeah.
could see that.
I plan on talking some other
See you
time
soon.
Yeah.
on this last area,
Sure.
so I've sort of held off for it, but thank you for coming.
Oh, you're very welcome.
My pleasure. So,
There's a DTS core here.
yeah, you guys okay? Don't feel like you need to stay, but, yeah, so Google starts to make money, and they start to develop data centers. They start to buy up all sort of patents, telecommunications patents on fiber optics and things like that. In Boston, where I live, we've got Google Fiber. But they collect data, they basically download the internet every day, right, in their data centers, and they're able to analyze that with MapReduce and Hadoop, those technologies that they develop. With Yahoo developed a lot of it as well. But,
So the key technology of Telecommunications for the data-centric security and e-commerce is searchability.
searchability.
And that leads to big data and AI, that's the connection.
Right, yes. I had these sort of all under one regime,
Mhm.
the sort of global e-commerce, but now I'm starting to see that there are some different
Mhm.
things that.
The ability to search, as you said, instead of surf,
Right,
alters it to have a new central location for those searches, and that's very different than before. As a technological guide of the information itself.
in the age of surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff.
Who wrote that?
Shoshana Zuboff. Just came out earlier this year. I read it during the break.
And I told you about the other book by Yasha Levine called, instead of Silicon Valley, it's called Surveillance Valley. So you might look at your data-centric big data analysis, what you said, these are very permeable boundaries of four, but he's arguing that one of the goals that was written about in newspapers in the 1970s, it was a massive spy network. Internet was not simply a military operation per se, but they wanted to have access to everybody who was working on things and to be able to look into everything they wanted in different databases. So there was no firewalling against anything. And it was sort of a larger spy network itself at the time.
So she talks about behavioral value, reinvestment side. So she talks about behavior. She's a social psychologist who was the first woman ever tenured in the Harvard Business School. And she retired recently to write this book. And she's been doing a lot of this research, which I find quite intriguing. And it is this, there's kind of two versions of it. So that's the early version of it, and I'm going to explain it. So we have data science technology that basically monitors users. Let's go back to Fitbit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you have a guy, because he's walking, he's got his Fitbit, right? It's producing data. And the data is analyzed, and that's a smokestack there because there's data exhaust there because there's extra data. But it's analyzed and comes back as a service improvement. Right? So in that case, you know, it helps you get in shape, right? Or you have cars, for example. So you have like a driverless car that would be able to produce data to help you get to your to help your commute go faster, right? So this is the basic model where behavioral data is used to improve a service. And here's the data exhaust. Right? So users, you have the data is analyzed and improves the service. So here's the same model at the bottom here. But instead of data exhaust, there's a lot of information that's created, right? Here's a vault. You see this vault that's being created here. And because this information is valuable, this is surplus behavioral data on the routes that you take to get to work, right? So
That's the NSA metadata.
yes. Yes, good point. But the data becomes, as she argues, a new means of production. So it is that information is being used to create new, what she calls prediction products. And so there's another book I've been reading, Prediction Machines. And it is the development of recommendation engines, for example, on Netflix or YouTube, for example.
Pasquale's book on the rise of the black box society is very similar on the darker side of privatized algorithms now guiding us without us understanding, or companies having to explain why they recommend certain things over others, being used, you know, to vet people for jobs, and, you know, it may be racially biased, it may be class biased, it may be language biased, but we don't have the rights to really analyze this machinery you're talking about. It's kind of an algorithm. That's not what she's saying. The rise of an algorithmic state, right, that monitors and guides our future behavior, not just serves products, but tries
prediction
to
products, right?
Yeah.
It can produce an algorithm, but it produces all this information that can be sold in other markets.
Right.
So the information from the Fitbit
Right.
can be bought by pharmaceutical.
And Jim's point, if it's not digital, you'd never be able to transfer it across mediums like this. So
Sure.
That's the premise of a lot of this. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, arguing that these markets and future behavior create these surveillance revenues, right? A lot of money to be made, right? And it's, yeah, McDonald's announced yesterday a huge purchase of a data science company. Ford wants to move at, well, it still wants to produce cars, but it sees its future in the data.
I also think of the whole industry of server-sided analysis in real time of hacking or things. That's a whole, if you talk to One Bason, his dissertation under Larson, all about why Korea doesn't have that industry because of its NKPI structure, where the state, states still continue to be very important in security here, but this is a very privatized structure, and servers themselves and most other legal regimes globally became common standard expectation that it's the server and the service provider that provides security. It's not the user's fault if they're hacked, it's kind of the service provider's fault. But in Korea, the whole structure is different, and service providers had no legal responsibility to avoid hacking, which said that.
So who, the service providers?
Had no responsibility under the NKPI structure in Korea to have a server or bank-based financial security network. And so there was no, FD, I think it's like FD, not foreign, FDS, it's like a financial data service or analysis. Started first in PayPal, who did 24-hour analysis. It also encouraged a lot of money to go into AI. China and its Alibaba have been developed that in China as kind of a private, analysis of big data based upon the service or firm itself and not the state. Whereas in Korea, the state kind of continues to be quite powerful until 2015, when NKPI was sort of attempted to be demoted as the single legal standard for digital authentication in Korea. But so the statism in Korea lasted much longer, which led to one of the big Korean failures and expectation of standardizing technologies, which was, digital authentication did not globally become like that in Korea. It stayed until 2015 or beyond as a responsibility of the state and responsibility of individual consumers, because the PKI structure of technology didn't have room for a third wheel of server-based analysis. And that's sort of the privatization, I think, you're talking about too, that you might look into. I'll tell you the name of those companies, but whoever started to do the large 24-hour analysis, it's financial, it's PayPal. So look at PayPal's background for the beginning of these intersections of AI, big data, and funding these things, and necessity of finding this person never logged in from this location before. It's that kind of instantaneous service that warns you about that. Google now does that with, if I log in a different IP address, Google warns me like,
Yeah, right.
are you?
Right, yeah, when it came back to Korea.
So that's sort of the AI of the privatized server-based security, but Korea didn't need that as an industry because of the previous continuation of the national structure. So I'm just saying PayPal is probably a great thing to uncover where they got this kind of surveillance capitalism model, and also Alibaba.
And a Russian company.
So Bullwinkle and Moose, I think you're watching too much on that.
I'm watching too much CNN.
Basically, it's become Bullwinkle Moose kind of thing. CNN, I'm sorry. Jim loves CNN, but CNN is crap.
This is kind of what I just wanted to end on.
Okay, no, that's interesting. So moving from just services to now prediction and picking people up at their regular place. I still think the state's quite involved in all of this. I wonder how you would integrate, the NSA being the largest data repository of all these things. For globally, it's global. It's not just you reduce the nation, but it's still a continuation. There's one nation attempting to gain kind of Bretton Woods style control through monitoring everybody now. No, that's very, I love putting the political economic thing into the drive of, because that's what Saskia, you don't quote Saskia Sassen, but you're familiar with her work. I mean, basically, she's arguing, when computers get cheaper, it's telecommunication networks makes nodes of cities, and those cities were the financial centers, finance, insurance, real estate. They needed places to go, and they built those physical nodes. But later, as it gets get more network value, smaller, cheaper, faster, more distributed. you still have these readouts of consolidation that continue into these other regimes. And
Right.
that's the way I teach the mobile class. I don't teach it as like separate regimes, but we're thinking very similar. I'm just saying that these readouts are built first, and then the peasants and citizens get the same technology, and that's where we are. We're these massive centralized arms, like the state never really ends, in my view. It just continues alongside, but then major companies get it, and then now we have it, and that's where we are. We're facing each other trialectically, sort of, that everybody's equally armed with this, ICT for mobile development in whatever ways that it gets utilized. It can continue to be utilized by states, by major global companies, or they collaborate, or it gets people. Some places, really it's the rise of really strong states again, ironically. I mean, you argue that it's reducing states in the average, but look at China. I mean, so in some places, it's made the United States a stronger state because of this massive big data. So, I mean, it's going sort of backwards to a more secure monitoring and prediction of all your dissidents and all the people that might complain, oh, let's look at, these people are communicating for the first time, we better start monitoring them. I mean, the AI will tell people this, and it's hard to have redress of grievances. You talk about democracy, you don't really mention it yet, but I mean, we're entering a world where the prediction of these algorithms are going to short circuit any kind of redress of grievances, because they're not going to be used democratically. That's I wouldn't doubt that. They're going to be used by whoever has it. I mean, so I wonder about the rise, again, of strong states in this, data-centric security structure.
So sort of a singularity of military state
rejoining.
All coming back together, finance coming back together with the commercial power as well.
Brilliant. I mean, I think it's really brilliant. Somebody needs to write this book, and I'm glad you've been pondering over it for such a long time. Is there anything else? Or I'm trying to play host, but just participant observer too. I don't want to push you. If you want to keep talking, I mean, but we're already 15 minutes over.
I think it's time to go.
Okay.
My daughter wants to talk with me.
Okay.
And
perfect segue to the network world.
And like I said, I'd like to give a follow-up talk on this.
Okay.
I'm actually doing it with the PhDs in 572, but I do not include in my class.
Okay, good. Thank you, Dr. Pennings.